What you think about that? Obedience can be costly, can it? Obedience can mean that sometimes God will put you in places that do not make sense. Obedience means that sometimes what you do may make some people think you're crazy because it doesn't make sense. Wow. All right. If you will, let's start at the top of the page on your notes, please. And then we'll take them one by one and kind of talk them out as we go, okay? So number one, there's a difference between having Jesus as your friend and you being a friend of Jesus. What is the distinction between having Jesus as a friend and being a friend? What's the difference, do you think? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and distinguish each one individually. All right, so if you have Jesus as your friend, what does that mean?
He owns you, or you own him.
Okay.
Both, you know.
Okay. Now, what do you see as a, if you will, a level of commitment, the difference between having and being?
You got a relationship.
There's a relationship there. And so, like having Jesus kind of means, well, I have a relationship, but I'm not really all in. But if I'm being a friend to Jesus, all right, and Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments, right? And so that is the idea of the difference really between having Jesus as my friend, because he wants to have that relationship with us. But if you want it, you're going to have to be his friend. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is the being cost you something. Yeah, there's that surrender, really, is what it comes down to. Exactly. All right, any other thoughts about that? Okay. Number two, Jesus clearly says, when I look to see who's a friend of mine, there's one thing I look for, and that's obedience. All right, I just quoted that verse for you. Now, why do you think, of all the things that Jesus could ask for to show him, demonstrate to him our love, why do you think it's obedience that he called for?
Because it shows that you are surrendered wholly to him.
Yeah.
Fully.
And so it comes down to that idea that he is the Lord of my life. All right, if he is the Lord of my life, for me to take it from words to actions, that means I'm going to obey what he says. Okay? All right, any other thoughts about that? Okay, number three. There is no substitute for obedience. What's the first one? Worship is not a substitute for obedience, are not a substitute for obedience, is not a substitute for obedience. Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Think about that. Let me ask you a question. Can you come to church and go through all the motions and leave not having worshiped? But what if you're one of the ones that I call on to pray? Well, all right. Well, what if you do more than just give a tenth? You give your whole paycheck this week. Well, what if you're here every time the doors are open? All right. So showing up is not necessarily worship. Right? You understand? All right, so when we think of worship is not a substitute for obedience. Now, I think of, I believe it was David who said, it is better to obey than to sacrifice. Because again, David could say or see that I can go through the motions of offering one of my best lambs on the altar of God and it not be a sacrifice of worship and obedience, because I could be concerned about what somebody else is watching and say, oh, he gave his best lamb. That's the prettiest, spotless lamb, most beautiful, healthiest lamb, and he gave it to God. Oh, right? Now, we don't come and offer lambs, but what do we do that might not be meaningful? Well, if I'm coming for show, if I'm coming so you'll see my new vehicle, If I'm coming so I can show off my new outfit? I mean, think about it. If I'm coming so I can say I'm better than them folks out there that don't come like they ought to. You see? And so when it comes down to it, there's no substitute for obedience. The worship, the doctrine, the right belief, the prayer, all of those are wonderful things, but they are the essence of what religion is. Where when we're talking about obedience, that's relationship. Okay? All right, anybody have a thought about that? Okay. Number 4, there comes a point where you don't need to anymore. Now that almost sounds like heresy, doesn't it? Why?
Because you're not going to obey, why should you pray if you're not going to do what he tells you to do?
If you go ahead and read the rest of it, there's your answer.
You just need to obey.
Obey.
That's right. And so, but it sounds real Christian-like, where we know something's going on that we need to be a part of, and we say, well, I'm going to pray about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to pray about that. Where really I'm saying, God, I'm praying that you'll pull somebody else up to do that. Right? Think about it. So there is a time where it becomes pointless to pray anymore. God is not, He's not wanting to hear us reason with Him, rationalize it out. If God has called us to something, He expects me to obey. God is never going to take something from my life that is sinful, and I'm never going to convince God that for me it's right. Okay? So it is a matter of there's times, like we've talked about before, if you're out of a job, you don't have to pray if you should rob the bank to be able to get through the next week. Okay, because you don't. You don't rob the bank. That's stealing. All right? You get up and you try to find a job. If it means going to somebody and them saying, well, I heard somebody say this. This was interesting. I thought he was talking about this scenario of somebody that couldn't find a job. And so he said, he told the man, he said, listen, he said, I really need a job. And he said, I will be willing to work for you for free until you feel like I'm worth something to you. And you know what? He got the job. You see? I mean, because we have an absence of that today, work ethic. And but when people see that you have the what it takes to get it done, it changes things. All right, number 5. How do you experience the joy of your master? All right, so why would obeying him bring joy? Yeah, that word peace, I really think it really sums it up, because there can be a whole lot of things wrong in life, but if you've got peace with God, and again, think about the peace of God that passes all understanding, which means in my circumstances, I shouldn't feel this peace. I shouldn't have this sense of joy in my life. But you know what? When you're walking in the will of God, doing what God's called you and the time that He's called you to do it, being faithful, obedient, that is ripe for the peace of God to enshroud your life, inside and out. And that's where the joy comes from. All right, anybody else have a thought about that? Okay. This one is actually one we've said before, and I've heard it most often from Charles Stanley. It's one of the biblical principles that he talks about a lot. When God speaks, you need to and leave to Him. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to obey God and leave the consequences to Him? Yeah. All right, let's go back to the lady that was sharing her testimony at the end. Okay? Now, she had a clear sense from God that she needed to leave her present work. And obviously, she's a single lady, I gathered just from the way she was talking. So, that kind of helped the situation. But she sensed that God was calling her away from what she was doing to do something else. But she didn't know exactly what it was. And I'm sorry, but that reminds me of somebody we talked about this morning. Remember, Abraham went out not knowing whither he went? And that is exactly what happened, it seems like, in her case. And the whole process was about a year's time that she was doing just, if you will, menial tasks to make it. And but she sensed that's what God had called her to do. And it's like my Sunday school class and we were talking about this concept this morning. We tend to, if we're not careful, our human nature tends to make us or push us to value people by what they do. Especially, I want you to think about us guys. If one man meets another man and they're going to be around each other for a little while, generally after they get over the, hey, how you doing, and they kind of get past whatever the latest news was or whatever, do you know what the first question one gentleman will ask another when they want to find out something about them? Well, what do you do? What do you do? And for men in particular, that tends to be a man's source of, this is who I am. This is my identity. All right, now if you take the average woman who's a mother, and two women get together and they start talking, oh, well, do you have kids? How old are they? Tell me about them. And for a woman, her sense of security and her sense of identity tends to be in her relationships, where with men it tends to be in the things that we've conquered. Am I right? Okay. Now think about that. When God comes and He shakes me at my core as a man, He's going to tend to go after those things that I value the most. And again, for a lady, He's going to go after those relationships that you value the most. But I want you to think about Abraham. If you remember, God told Abraham to take Isaac and offer him as an offering on top of the mountain. You remember that? And that was, and it's so neat to me because when I think about what God asked him to do, God had no intention of Abraham killing his son. But I believe God was trying to give a picture to Abraham of what God was going to do to his own son to cover the sins of those two that was on that mountain as well as all the rest of us. You see, and God was at work in those things. And so when we think about coming and obeying God and leaving the consequences to Him, more often than not, when God speaks to us, He's going to challenge us in ways that grip us and shake us. And we need to know that we can hold on to Him, and if nobody else understands, that's all right. We've got to do what God's called us to do, even if it doesn't make sense sometimes. All right. Any questions, thoughts? Now, I figured there'd be some conversation about that one now. Come on. All right. Number 7. Obedience is always the avenue through which you find greater fellowship and intimacy with God. Right? I went ahead and filled in the blank for you, and I want to ask you why. Why is it that obedience is the avenue that leads to greater fellowship and intimacy? Why do those things grow? That's right. Do you know any children that are spoiled? You don't have to name names or anything. All right. And what is the problem with spoiling a child? They get to where they don't appreciate anything because they're given, and it never cost them anything, right? And so when we think about our relationship with God, there's one place where in the New Testament where it talks about casting your pearls before the swine. Now, that sounds insulting. But would you, everybody around here used to have hogs, but I guarantee you of those who had hogs around here, none of them gave a pearl necklace to the Queen Sow. Right? Why? Did you, Grammy? Did you ever do that? No, you didn't. You didn't have the pearls to give him, or you didn't have a Queen Sow? And why wouldn't you give pearls to a pig? They don't appreciate them, right? All right, now when we think about, I want you to know that God's desire, His premier desire, is that we bring glory and honor to Him. Okay? Secondary to that is our relationship with Him. And again, I want you to remember that I don't bring God anything because He doesn't need anything else. But He desires us. He wants us. And if that's not just the top of the cream, that God would desire us in our imperfection, in our sinfulness, in our bad habits, and all those things. And He desires us and He loves us in spite of them. That blesses my heart. Okay? Anybody else? Okay. Number 8. The greatest single way you can engage in spiritual warfare is to obey God tells you to do. Now, all right, what's spiritual warfare? Yeah, it's the battle that we have with our flesh. It's the battle that we have with satanic forces. All right, so that's where spiritual warfare. Do you know where that spiritual warfare takes place generally? Between your ears, right? And it's in those places. I want to remind you, I believe sometimes, I want you to take the devil seriously, okay? I want you to realize he's there and he fouls up things all the time, okay? I want you to realize, but I don't want to give him more credit than he's due. You know who my greatest enemy is? Me. Me. And biblically, where I get that from, and just very briefly, is during the time of the millennial kingdom, okay, when Jesus comes and reigns physically on this earth, Satan's going to be shut up in a pit. He's going to be locked away. And we find that by the end of the millennium, those people who enter the millennial kingdom, which are everybody that enters that kingdom is saved. These are believers. And those who were on earth, who survived the tribulation, were saved. They went into the millennial kingdom. They were still physical beings who could still have children. There was 1,000 years that transpired, and in that time, children were born. And children who were born from saints, without the influence of the devil, still, at the end of that 1,000 years, rise up and try to fight Christ. And what did that? Their own human nature. And the devil wasn't even there to participate in it. So that's why I tell you, don't give him more credit than he's due. He messes up enough, okay? But mine and your greatest enemy a lot of times is the one we see in the mirror, okay? So when we engage in that spiritual warfare, how do we win it? By doing whatever God tells us to do.
Obey.
Because we're following Him and not ourselves.
Okay, that's right. And what I want you to get to in this thought is this. Is there any area of your life presently that you're holding off limits for what God would have in your life? Is there anything that you're holding on to in your life, if God was to take His finger and put it on that and say that needs to go, is there anything in your life that is so precious that you say, God, anything but that? You see, He deserves to be Lord of our life in every area. And I want you to realize that He points to, it may not be something that's sinful, but it may be a blessing that you are holding on to and have made an idol out of. It may be a relationship. It may be a habit. And again, it may not be sinful in itself, but it has become sinful because I've put it in a place of value above my relationship with Him, because I would rather have that than I would to obey Him. Make sense? Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, number 9. Don't ever blame anyone else for your... Why not?
They can't, nobody make you disobey but you.
Well, I'm messing up the self-esteem crowd by talking about this, right? But you know, we've got to give grace in that, you know, and I found out more so since I've been pastoring than any time before, but not everybody knew what it was like to grow up in a loving family. Not everybody had that. Not everybody knew what it was like to have a family that cheerleads you as you go off into whatever it is that you sense God's called. Not everybody has that. Not everybody gets up in the morning just joyful to look at life because look at what God's provided for me. Look at the family He's given. Not everybody has that. And when I think about, again, the culture that we live in, our culture tends to blame everybody else for the problems that I make. Right? And so if we go back to what a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ is all about, it's about taking all my marbles, all my broken marbles, all my missing marbles, all my stolen marbles. The reason I say that is forgiveness comes into the equation, repentance comes into the equation. And when I say forgiveness, that's me forgiving others. But I bring all my big old sack of junk that is rotting. And you realize when I get saved, I lay those things at the feet of the cross. I surrender those things when I surrender my life. But then too often I come back and pick them up again. Well, when we pick them up, let's go back and lay it down. And again, we find that as we go back over and again, we find that time frame begins to lengthen between us picking them back up again and taking them back again. It's worth the trip. It's worth the trip. And so we need to own our stuff. I believe that's really the point. Number 10. You have all the power of heaven available to you to obey anything God tells you to do. All right, Jackie, what does it mean to you?
We have the same power that Jesus gives us. We be obedient.
That's right. So if God has called you to something and it makes no sense, well, what does that say? Ma'am, do it anyway. But I go back to something I said to you this morning. When I said, so often when I stand before you, I feel inadequate. And I get discouraged just like y'all do. Somebody can say something, they may not even mean anything by it. But sometimes it just kind of takes the wind out of you, you know? And then I go back to this very concept right here. The power of heaven is available to me if I'm willing to obey what God's called me to do. I may not understand it. Nobody else might appreciate it. But when you're doing what God's called you to do, God is obligated to give you the power it takes, the resources it's going to take to make it happen. And He's going to push you through. Even if He has to drag you, Jackie. But God is committed. He's all in. And really it comes down to this question. God's all in. Are you? Okay? So that's what obedience is all about. All right, does anybody else have a thought or a comment that you'd like to share? Any weird questions you want to ask? Come on, y'all. All right, y'all making this too easy tonight. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I hope this was a help to you. I hope it was an encouragement. I hope it was a challenge as far as that's concerned. Look forward to getting to see you Wednesday night, 6:30. We'll look at day 1 and day 2 in our book. And then Saturday, we're looking forward to our gathering at the cabin from 4 to 7. And I'll probably send out a message a little later in the week when we kind of get things ironed out, when we kind of see how the weather's going to be exactly. And that message will be to ask for help in relation to if we're able to have a hayride, if we can have somebody kind of help us out. Get those things together. If we're able to sing, we're going to need to set up the equipment to do that. And so anyway, there's several things that we're going to try to do, but we need to see kind of how it's going to be looking. So I'm going to send that message out toward the end of the week, and if you can help out with that, that'd be great. But we really look forward to being together for that. Does anybody else have anything you'd like to share? Okay. Well, how about we go home? That sound all right? Miss Betty, would you mind closing us in prayer?